guess I wanted to start it by asking about the press release that you guys put out last week. Since you put it out, have you noticed any changes, I guess maybe help by the government or just any further support provided to non-status people as a result of the press release?
Unfortunately, no. We've been able to, after we release a press release, sort of highlighting the issues migrants are facing during the curfew and more broadly during the pandemic. I mean, we've seen a positive response, I would say, from civil society and from media. Also, some doors have opened at the municipal level, and there was a motion by the borough mayor of Villeray Park Extension, St. Michel, Juliana Fumagalli, that will be presented at City Council this week, calling for the regularization of non-status workers, but also um, really, yeah. So we've seen some movement, but unfortunately, it's not enough at this moment. So there's still definitely big challenges that we face because of what needs to actually happen.
Okay. I understand that. I imagine these things, they take a lot of work and it's kind of a continuous process. So are deportations, are they continuing on during the pandemic or are they kind of halted at this point?
At the beginning of the pandemic, deportations for migrants was suspended, but then beginning in the summer, they've resumed. And actually, the statistics came out just last week that actually this has been the highest number of deportations than in any other. It's since 2015. So not only have deportations resumed after they were suspended, it has been the highest number of deportations in the last 6 years. So there's kind of an irony uh, when all of this sort of the discussion about guardian angels and protecting guardian angels is that we've actually ramped up deportations.
By how much? Like, is there kind of like a figure maybe you could give me your estimation?
So the figure is over 10,000. It's roughly around 10,000, and it was above 2019 by nearly 1,000. So it's a significant jump. So it's roughly they have these targets that CBSA sets itself for in terms of removals, um, and it's usually roughly around 10,000. And some years they don't meet that target, but this year they were able to do that above expectations. And part of it is too is because they're just what they call voluntary returns, where people are so depressed, so squeezed, so sick of living in limbo or without status, that they simply they handed themselves in, uh, and and were deported back to their countries. Um, so that this was also part of the increase as well.
And would you say that exploitation in the workplace and not really receiving fair play, does this play a role in people, I guess, wanting to go back?
Absolutely. So I've been working with a woman named Virgela, who's from Haiti, and she's been here since 2017. And she was a refugee, and she was working at a place called Sherrington Cold Storage, which is a subsidiary of Olymel, right? One of the largest meat processing companies in all of Quebec. And she worked uh, through a temporary placement agency. Uh, she was injured severely, and as a result of that injury, um, she wasn't actually able to. As a result of that injury, she wasn't actually able to work for the last year and a half. and she wasn't able to get the CRB. And every time she, we meet, she's just like, I don't want to suffer anymore. Just send me home. I'm sick of the state of suffering. So the exploitation that people feel in the workplace in terms of uh, feeling, simply just dehumanized, working 10 to 12 hours a day, even longer, at below minimum wage if you're undocumented, or above minimum, around minimum wage if you do have status and a work permit. To be trapped in this kind of this prison internally, it takes a toll on people. And um, to always be treated that you're always completely going to be a second tier citizen, or even non-existent, because you have to live in the shadows, uh, ends up, uh, building the sort of the dynamic that forces people, uh, either to return. But I mean, and another way people, the only way that we can get through this is to demand regularization, right? That's one of the key ways to actually to be able to even challenge those injustices in the workplace, because employers actually know, uh, that they're not responsible. I mean, the benefit of them using a lot of these temp agencies is that, well, I didn't know who they were hiring. I didn't know, um, uh, how bad the pay really was, and so they wash their hands clean because the blame is through the agency. And so unfortunately you now have this sort of triangle, that puts pressure on these immigrant migrant workers, right, between agencies, client companies, and as opposed to giving them any sense of relief. And the curfew is one example of this, where we are not telling society, the city's not coming out. We celebrate our undocumented population, right? They've made this city function. They're an integral part of our city. There's roughly 50,000 people with precarious or without status who live in the island of Montreal. And we're not going to punish them. We're going to celebrate them, right? But instead, they're being punished, right? They're being targeted in terms of the curfew. They're being ticketed. People feel that they're under the threat of deportation because people are afraid to be in contact with the police. So again, we have this dynamic where the city isn't coming out, to protect this population. The city, ostensibly is punishing them.
Um, so say, for example, the city doesn't want to provide regulation, doesn't want to provide status for migrants. What is something else that they can do to at least provide some type of relief?
So there's a few things. So the city can't actually do that. What we ask for the city is at least to raise that the voice, right? The mantle, right? They have power in terms of being able to approach the federal government or the provincial government. What we're asking the city is the things that they can do, right? No collaboration between the SPVM and the Canadian Border Services Agency, right? That no one should be in fear of getting arrested, right? And thus being deported, even from the SPM or from the SPVM, right? That there should just be no collaboration. Uh, and that allows also, especially women who live without status, who live in fear, maybe because of abusive partners and all of these situations, that they can't approach, um, particular agencies or authorities because of the fear of deportation. So, um, so that's the first thing the city can do, and the second thing the city can do is allow people to find a way where that they can access municipal services, from schooling to housing, to shelter, and during the pandemic to be a major point of resource in terms of emergency needs and financial needs for undocumented people who don't have access to all these other state programs. So that's another way, um, that the city can help. And there's been pilot projects around identification issued by the city that would then maybe allow them to access some services, but it needs to be greatly expanded and recognized. But those two things go hand in hand, and these are things that the city can actually do.
So does the exploitation of migrants benefit corporations?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is if you want to think about it, what we live in is in a moment where um, for corporations, especially those kinds of sectors of the economy, those corporations that can't be offshored, and what they've done in the global south, uh, they've done here, right? That they, in terms of the race of the bottom, right? So how do you get workers that are non-unionized at a lower price, um, and that are docile, right? And um, and corporations have been able to successfully to do that by exploiting migration and migrant workers, right? And that if I give a whole bunch of examples, right? So if we look at even the the largest of companies on this planet, Amazon, right? So the entire Amazon model is based on this exploitation of a usually racialized immigrant and migrant workforce, no matter where their facilities are, whether it be in Minneapolis, whether it be in Montreal, whether it be in Germany, right? That if we look at agriculture, right, and agribusiness, we think of these small mom and pop farms, but we have to think where the chain starts, right? For in the food industry, the food that it starts from these big retailers, right? So if we look at Metro, if we look at Loblaws and the Weston family, one of the wealthiest families in Canada, they set the price for all food commodities, right? They set the price of what they will be sold, how they'll be delivered, because they dominate the market, right? And so as a result, what you see is because of this pressure in terms of price and in terms of speed, is that if we look at the meat processing plants, the large Ollie mills, Smithfields, um, they rely on exploiting immigrant and migrant labor through temp placement agencies, paying absolutely pity wages. And if we take it back, if we look at the farmers, then where they exclusively use temporary foreign workers, usually from Guatemala or Honduras, uh, to catch high volumes of chicken, at below minimum wage, where people are working 16 hours a day. And so, and then if we look at the same model and we look at our healthcare system, right? Um, there was a report. So GDI, which is one of the biggest multinationals in terms of the cleaning sector, um, GDI claims, it pays well. It pays $16, $17 an hour. It's unionized. This is good work. But in order for them to make their profits, they constantly have to absorb more and more contracts, right? And so what that ends up doing is that they subcontract, and then they subcontract. And then the point is, at the end, you'll have people cleaning CHLSDs, hospitals, working $8 to $10 an hour, right? Who are immigrant and migrants. And that's how our system really works. Dollarama is another one where company hires exclusively immigrant and migrant labor. This is one of the wealthiest corporations in Canada and one of the wealthiest families in Canada, right? They're the eighth wealthiest family in Montreal, worth $2.52 billion, right? And their warehouse is full of, 1,000 immigrant and migrant workers. And all of this results in um, uh, all of this results in a kind of a pattern where uh, the ways you make money is by exploiting immigrant and migrant workers, right? And this is what we're seeing in sector across sector, right? So, and it goes, down the food chain all the way up, right? And Uber is the same Fedora is the same, right? So even in the platform economy, where people think about gig workers and people working in coffee shops, who built Uber's well? Who built um, it's the people who are driving their cars 15, 16 hours a day, right? And mostly racialized immigrant and migrant workers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for explaining that. I just want to jump back to long-term care homes. Is there anything that the government is doing that, you know, allows for these workers to be exploited? Like any specific policies that just make this kind of system thrive?
In terms of long-term care homes, I mean, definitely in the private sector where a lot of these are large multinationals. I mean, even one of the in Ontario, there's a company called Chartwell. Chartwell, on its board, actually has the former premier Mike Harris in Ontario. Uh, he is actually on their board, and so um, and the private care homes, I mean, are um, and this is the thing about care work where it's becoming more and more commodified, right? Where you have people being as sent into these homes, and the ways that these companies try to make money is by volume, right? uh and so and able to lower the price of residents being able to stay. Not only does it lower the quality of care, but it actually lowers um then the conditions on other workers. You know, we were working in a campaign for the Fight for 15 many years ago, where preposés and people and long-term care homes were fighting for $15 an hour wage. It's the minimum people should be getting, taking care of the most fragile people in our society, right? So it's rampant in that sector. So and you know, people still working for temp agencies. People are still being shuttled from home to home, even during after the first wave. Nothing had significantly changed. And so, as opposed to actually uh, nationalizing it or making the whole system public, um, where we take profit out, then we can actually pay people a decent wage. We can actually create the conditions where people are actually happy as well. You know.
Um, so do migrant workers, do they have to disclose to either the temp agency or their employer that they are non-status?
Uh, it depends on the agency. It depends on, you know, some agencies will request a work permit. Some agencies will request, um, you know, some identification or work permit. And some agencies know that they're specifically, you know, they operate like day labor, what we call fly-by-night agencies, right? Where they pay cash, right? And those are the ones that don't require. Some agencies find ways around various loopholes, but it depends really on the kind of the agency and where these workers are being placed.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything that people can do to kind of provide some relief, maybe uh, like an example of BDS towards corporations, like not supporting these corporations until they fairly pay non-status folks?
I mean, I think there's two things people can really do, right? So there's one is that uh, people can, I think there's, you know, really great campaigns right now for regularization. I think that's a big push, and that's something that we, you know, Solidarity Across Borders, the Immigrant Workers Centre, the Women's Committee of the Association Temporary Agency Placement Workers, and then there are campaigns targeting particular corporations and their treatment of immigrant and migrant workers. So we have a campaign around Dollarama that's been launched since March, and we've won some gains, and we're continuing to push for permanent pay increases, but also permanent jobs as well, not temp jobs. Right, that's a big factor as well. So that way, that solidarity helps workers the ability to actually to organize. And
And
all of that is on our website, especially the campaign around Dollarama. And in terms of divestment, it is an interesting strategy, right? Because what we've done with Dollarama is there was a motion passed at SMU at McGill University, the student union at McGill University, to as a major stockholder of Dollarama, they have $2 million invested in McGill, is to be able to put pressure on McGill University to divest or to threaten to divest until they change their conditions, right? And so we're trying to do that, the United Church, because Dollarama is one of these sort of blue chip stocks in terms of the Canadian stock market landscape, right? So there's a lot of institutions that hold it. So it is an interesting way that we're also trying to add pressure and to raise the issue of that immigrant migrant worker space.
Okay, thank you. I guess, could you name alongside Dollarama and Amazon, are there any other top corporations that come to mind, specifically in Montreal, that exploit migrants?
I know hold it. Ollie Mill was one of them, but I mean, I think one that's become a household name has been Good Food. Uh, Good Food is a company that sort of delivers these, not just groceries, but almost pre-packaged kind of meals where you make them yourself. And they've grown throughout the pandemic. They're quite large now, right? And there's a lot of issues faced. I mean, it's better than some types of workplaces, absolutely. Don't, but it still faces issues in terms of pay, in terms of health and safety conditions. We were dealing with people from, like we said, Ollie Mill, which is another major corporation. In terms of other warehouses, in the warehousing sector, it's rampant, right? So David's Tea, um, is an interesting case, as well as Aldo or uh, so throughout. And I mean, and in terms of kind of the use of agency work, even things that we become accustomed to, Rise Kombucha or Lufa Farms, all of these things that we think about as local and green and alternative. Uh, Also, unfortunately, rely on the same model because it's the only way that they can find people to do these kinds of jobs, but then also at the same time for them to make money.
I know that you kind of spoke a little bit on this, but I'm wondering a bit more specifically, what is it that allows for situations where non-status people are fairly paid and treated to thrive? Is it, Canada's neoliberal system, capitalism, a mix of everything?
Yeah, no, it really is. It's a mix of all of these things, right? So it's like we saw these changes. So in terms of Canada's immigration system, has been re-engineered for the last 10 to 15 years, right? It's been this move away from permanent migration you know, for the majority of immigrants to temporary migration through the temporary foreign worker program has been one way, but also the ways in which borders have become more restrictive, right? So, and much of that hasn't been changed from Trudeau, right? In terms of, um, signaling a drastic change in terms of the way that the refugee system works, in terms of the appeal process, uh, or to upend the pre-removal risk assessment, which nobody ever wins, which is the last effort that people have to remain without status. So we close the pathways for people to actually to live with status and thus to no longer be exploited. But as instead we funnel more and more, and then what we do at the same time is that we open up new categories for permanent residency, right? The Canada Experience class, high skilled worker programs, and so so we're creating this larger and larger pool of precarious people in our society. 1 out of 23 people live with some kind of precarious status in Canada, right? So then that uh, corporations become addictive on that logic, right? And uh, and as a result, um, of that, uh, because of the logic of the system, they they become very much integral into that system. We look at the pandemic where they just couldn't find workers to do agricultural work when migrant workers weren't coming. It just was impossible. It was almost if like the sky had fallen. No one wanted to pay better wages. No one wanted to have better conditions. Well, there's like, well, Quebecois don't want to work here. Well, I mean, is it really that no one wants to work there, or no one just wants to work a low-paid, bad job, right? And how do you resist that, right? So, but they know they have this docile workforce. So it's this combination of the two factors that allow for this to take place on a very global scale, systemic scale.
This agricultural issue, this was at the beginning of the pandemic?
Yes, so this was during the first wave when the growing season began, right? March, April, right? So, and
And
that's when a lot of the temporary foreign workers in the agricultural sector start arriving, is in April.
okay, so they weren't essentially in Canada yet to kind of fill these jobs?
Yep.
Okay. And I wanted to ask, some of the programs, the federal programs you just listed, are they helping some migrants achieve status at all, or just kind of like a slow process?
No, they haven't. I mean, it's just a slow process. I mean, in terms of because no one really wins. So you just drag out, and for migrants, the only utility is that the longer they stay, maybe they'll be accepted through one of these means. But it's both a way of delaying their deportation, but also at the same time, it leads to that inevitability as well, unfortunately.
So it's more just kind of securing them in these jobs. So it doesn't really help their, them maybe stay in Canada, but it just kind of helps Canada's workforce essentially. Okay.
And it gives a veneer of upholding international law, right, around the protection of refugees, right? That we have an appeal system, that um, we have like due legal process, right? Uh, but all of that remains difficult for migrants, for refugees to actually to utilize, um, and then for other programs where workers can access permanent residency, there's still a lot of barriers for people coming in the lower streams, right? Agriculture, low skilled pilot project, domestic workers.
So what is it exactly that Canada has to uphold in terms of international law for migrants?
I mean, I think really that especially that people aren't going to be deported, that people have the right to asylum, people have the right as refugees in terms of the freedom of movement, but also that the right to security and safety, and the right to not be deported uh, to harm, right? That refugees won't be placed in harm, right? And we have a responsibility to protect refugees, right? So, um, but instead, uh, um, what we do is we find other mechanisms to sort of to undermine or whittle down that process, right? The Safe Third Country Act being one of them, right? Where people who make claims in the U.S. aren't allowed to make claims here, right? Uh, and sort of we limit um, the ability for refugees to actually to access their rights as refugees.
I've seen, and I know you've seen it too, animosity projected onto migrant people with, narratives including, oh, they're stealing our jobs, ridiculous things like that. Would you say that maybe this is emphasized by some political parties to make the working class more vulnerable as a whole?
I mean, absolutely, right? Because what we see is, I mean, the way that what this does in terms of this like anti-migrant sentiment and sort of both even from certain people, even Bernie Sanders, right? is is that it ignores the ways in which employers divide, workers, right? That the ways that they cheapen the labor, the ways that they make work more precarious, as opposed to blaming and scapegoating migrants who are not the cause of this problem, right? That it's not migrants' fault for lowering the wages, right? It's not migrants' fault for um, uh, for the problems that that are feeding this base of right wing populism, right? It's corporations, right? And then they walked away unscathed from this debate, right? And so it definitely makes because the same forces that are going to keep making working class people more vulnerable only gain from this, right? And so that's what we have to challenge, right?
Would you say that at least a part of the migrant issue in Canada is really based on classism?
I mean, that's an interesting way of looking at it, and I think so. I think that it is an anti-working class sentiment, right? That I mean, abstractly, but then also there was some studies in the United States where looked at that most voters for Trump, or a good proportion, were actually high income earners, right? So again, that it is in essence an anti-working class thing, right? Because we should be standing with workers wherever they're coming from, and wherever they are actually working, right? It's not about positing uh, the way that uh, those dynamics are shaped by uh, employers, or capitalists, in the ways in which that they've uh, structured and the ways they've actually exploited working people, right? It's not about migrant workers don't have the power to do that over other workers. So it really, um, I mean, absolutely, I would agree with you that the rise of anti-migrant sentiment is definitely in a broad sense an anti-working class sentiment.
And just jumping back to kind of political parties that maybe project animosity onto migrants. Have you seen this with the CAC government or any kind of levels of the Montreal government?
So definitely with the CAC government, where um, the CAC government has, in all of their rhetoric around being anti-migrant, what was funny was uh, they pursued temporary foreign workers, right? Because then they're off the books, right? So what CAC did was that permanent migration is down, right? We limited the PEQ, we've restricted permanent migration, but then it's a classic conservative trick, right? We increase the numbers of temporary foreign workers we can count because they're just temporary migrants. So they don't get counted in the statistics. So then the go can turn around to people in the regions. Well, we dealt with the migration question. Aren't you happy? When you actually have the same number of people coming in, if not more.
Just in terms of like making things difficult for migrants to receive fair pay and to actually become a Canadian citizen or a resident of their province. Is there anyone you would kind of like to identify who are setting these policies within government to make non-status people vulnerable?
I mean, the unfortunately the liberals have been masters at this, right? I mean, if we look now, what's going to happen most likely? I mean, there still be challenges, but uh, Biden is proposing comprehensive immigration reform. We're going to see almost 11 people come out. This could be, potentially massive. And the fact that he brought it up alone, and yet when and Trudeau, and then everyone thinks about Trudeau and the Syrian refugees and how people fleeing terror and they can come here. And when refugees did start coming here, not the refugees he likes, we tried to find ways that would stop them from coming, right? And so again, the liberals are 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 masters of this, right? And so um, so in terms of the political parties, I think the number one problem is it's the Liberal Party of Canada that's making people vulnerable, right? It's not, um, but it's able to do so because it holds this, this mantle of multiculturalism, of diversity, but at the same time, uh, continuing similar immigration policies as their conservative predecessors.
And are there any policies that have come up during the pandemic by the Liberals to make this situation much more difficult?
Uh, I mean, I mean, unfortunately, during the pandemic, we thought that there would be, this program to regularize guardian angels, right? And so, unfortunately, became extremely restrictive. Well, part of that is Quebec's responsibility, but the federal government had leeway to find other paths, right? So, it's an easy cop out by Trudeau, and to be able to say that we couldn't because of Quebec, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so again, the and the pandemic really showed that we were relying on all of these essential workers or guardian angels, and then it's just been a slap in the face.
Thank you. And I just want to ask if the motion this week at City Council, if it doesn't go through, what would you like to be done? How can we move forward?
Well, I mean, I think if it doesn't go through, I mean, we just need to really build a broad sense of solidarity, right? We really need to be building the kind of movement that like puts pressure on Valerie Plant, right? Like this is a question of, this moment she wants to stand against systemic racism, then you stand behind this motion, right? And we have to make that wedge. And so I think for people, it's really depending on what this motion does or doesn't do, uh, that we have to continue to fight for a solidarity city in a really big way in this context of the curfew, but of the pandemic. Uh, I mean, it hasn't changed things, but what it exposed is the crisis facing undocumented migrants who live in the city. So to put pressure really on Projet Montreal and on the new commissioner on systemic racism.
Thank you. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think is important for me to know or consider?
No, I think it's been pretty. I don't have any questions. I don't have any. I don't think I missed anything. I'm not sure, but
okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know I had a lot of questions, but
it's great.
You really, really helped me understand the situation a lot better. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Savannah. Have a good day.
Talk to you soon. Thanks again. Bye.